So welcome, everyone. We are thrilled to have you join us today. Excelsior University's leadership, the Center for Social Justice, and the Civic Engagement Rope Team welcome you to Excelsior celebration of Constitution Day, of our shared exploration of democracy and our democratic engagement, and of our critical and intentional multi-perspective dialogue on democracy and diplomacy. We have a very special guest with us today, Dr. Paul Lachelier, founder and director of Learning Life. Thank you for visiting us this afternoon, Paul. We are honored to have you. But before we introduce you formally, though, I have the pleasure of sharing the microphone with Dr. David Scable, president of Excelsior University, who has kindly offered to say a few words about democracy. David?
Thank you, Daniel, and I apologize for being a minute late here. It's great to be with all of you, and very pleased that we're doing this presentation and this dialogue. President Jimmy Carter once said that democracy is not a spectator sport. And this is a quote that's terrific to start our conversation. As we gather today, we're reminded that democracy's strength lies not in its institutions, but in the active engagement of its citizens. In an era marked by polarization and information difficult to verify, it's more crucial than ever to reinvigorate our democratic systems and reclaim our roles as participants and not just bystanders. The power and health of democracy depends on our collective willingness to participate, to educate ourselves, and to engage in respectful dialogue. Research from the Pew Research Center shows that civic engagement is linked to increased trust in institutions and social cohesion. Moreover, a study by the National Conference on Citizenship found that communities with high levels of civic engagement experience better economic outcomes and greater social mobility. Yet many feel disconnected from the democratic process. A Gallup poll revealed that only 47% of people in the US responded feeling very or somewhat confident in the integrity of our elections. This disillusionment can have far-reaching consequences, eroding the foundations of our democratic society. So today we gather to explore ways to revitalize our democracy through personal and community involvement. And we'll examine strategies for fostering inclusive, respectful dialogue, building civic literacy and critical thinking, and encouraging voter registration and election participation, and also for supporting family and community-driven initiatives and advocacy. So join us as we explore the transformative power of active citizenship and collective responsibility. Together, let's reclaim our role in shaping the future of this democracy. So thank you, and Daniel, back to you.
Thank you, David. Thank you for that. Before we give the floor to Paul, I want to thank a number of people and units that made today's event possible, starting with Maria and Nyla from marketing, Erin, Jason, and Connor from communications, Jamie, Mackenzie, and Ellen from development, Mike, Sharon, and Kim from procurement, our president, David, Jill, and Lori from the president's office, Kamel from HR, and Pam from the Center for Social Justice. Thank you so much for your amazing partnership and support. We also have a couple of requests for you in terms of logistics. One is throughout the session, as you notice, our room is a regular Zoom space. So please mute yourself throughout the presentation and throughout the session, and then unmute as you engage in dialogue. We're asking also you to hold your questions to the end. We'll have a time when we'll respond to those, when Paul kindly has offered to engage us in dialogue. Once we do that, you are welcome to use the chat throughout the session and at that point. But if you want to participate, we request that you raise your hand so that we don't end up speaking on top of each other. And then be aware that this session is being recorded. If for some reason you do not want to show up in the recording, you're welcome to stop your video, so that you are not seen. So some logistics that we wanted to mention before we get started.
And Daniel, can I ask for one more?
Yeah, of course.
In the spirit of participant democracy, could everyone please turn on their cameras?
Thank you, David. And now I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Paul Lachelier, a civic entrepreneur, sociologist, and founder and director of Learning Life, which is a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit developing inclusive learning communities to widen and deepen participation in democracy and diplomacy. For over 30 years, Paul has worked on the front lines and frontiers of democracy. On the front lines, he has been an organizer in grassroots student, environmental, labor, and political party organizations, engaging diverse citizens on local to international issues. He has run for state legislative office and taught an innovative university course on community organizing. On the frontiers of democracy, Paul has worked on grassroots innovations from founding a university labor center to conducting a campus deliberative poll, running a student voting field experiment, and currently developing learning communities to engage more people in democracy and diplomacy. Through Learning Life, Paul leads 3 programs: a democracy learning community in the U.S. Capital Region, and online internationally, the Family Diplomacy Initiative and Citizen Diplomacy International. Before founding Learning Life in 2012, Paul taught at Stetson, Harvard, Tufts, and the University of Wisconsin. He holds a BA in sociology from Georgetown University and an MA and PhD in sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His writing, research, and programmatic work focus on democracy, diplomacy, citizen engagement, and education. And his writings have appeared in academic journals as well as popular media, including the Boston Globe, Orlando Sentinel, Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, Albuquerque Journal, the Fulcrum, and Truth Out. Paul, we're honored to have you with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniel. So I want to start actually in an interactive way. So I'm going to place 3 questions in the Zoom chat. And what I would appreciate is you guys, if you're willing to answer the first question right away. The other 2 questions are based upon my remarks. And so you'll want to hold, but also just formulate your thoughts around question number 2 and 3 as I talk. And you are more than welcome to put your questions and your comments based upon those questions in the Zoom chat. So I really would like you to engage, and I'm going to be leading or moderating a discussion, essentially, as I oftentimes do through my work, once I'm done giving you some thoughts to kind of prime or stimulate your minds. But just to start with, if you could, and if you're willing, of course, please introduce yourselves in the Zoom chat. So would love to, in many of your cases, your names are already written, so you don't need to write them again, but would love to know where you're coming from. So your city and your state, your occupation, and for those of you who are students, what you're studying and what your career plans are beyond your studies. So if you're willing to share that, I would much appreciate it. Fantastic. So I am going to switch over to a PowerPoint presentation that will give you some thoughts, in particular 7 uncommon thoughts on democracy, and then jump into some details and offer you some photos as well. Okay. Okay, to start off with, I want to give you a little bit of background about me. Daniel kindly gave you some background, but there are other things that are probably worth knowing because that will help to understand some of the comments that, or the thoughts that I'm going to be sharing with you. One of them is you may not detect it, but I am indeed, as the name indicates, I'm French American. I was born in France, lived in France until age 11. My mother is actually in on the conversation here. She's Spanish American. My father's French American. And so the experience of living in France and then transitioning to the United States had a lasting impact on me, in the sense that it stimulated my interest in culture. And culture here is a term that's oftentimes used, but not often defined. And so I want to give you kind of some precise definition of what that means. And it's essentially three things. It is the objects or materials in our lives, it is ways of thinking, and it is ways of acting. And that has led to lots of interest in particularly American political culture while I was still a scholar. Second is I have long been interested in politics, and that again emerges from my family. Both my parents have been for a long time interested in politics, and in fact, my mother is here. I'm gonna mention a couple of things about her and about her experience, because they have been formative for me. My mother and father always paid attention to news. It was either in newspapers or on television on a constant basis. I remember watching presidential conventions, whether I was paying attention or not, it was in the ether in our homes. But you guys, some of you, depending on your age, you may remember the film that came out in the early 1980s called The Day After. I was about, I think I was about 12 years old or 13 years old when I watched it. And I didn't watch it because I wanted to at that time. I watched it because my mother thought we should watch it. And at the time, I was kind of struck by it and ended up crying afterwards. But it left a lasting imprint on me. And more than anything, I think it conveyed the importance of introducing sometimes harsh realities to children, so that they are better prepared for the world they're going to be inheriting. And that's, one thing I thank my mother for, is that she was not afraid to introduce us to those things. And my mother has been an activist in various ways through in different parts of her lives. And so that has influenced my work as a person who's been involved in politics. Third, I'm a sociologist. And what that means is that I have studied and taught particularly in ways that underscore the importance of relationships, culture, and institutions. So I've already defined what culture means. Relationships, we tend to think of in intimate terms as our relationships with our friends and family. But as you're going to see, I'm going to be talking about relationships we have with other people in our lives, whether we like it or not. And lastly, institutions, which can basically be understood, it's another kind of vague term that's used a lot, but basically understood as crystallized forms of behavior. And the kinds of crystallized behavior that we have or fail to have is important to the life of our democracy. Lastly, I am, as Daniel mentioned, the founder and the director of Learning Life, and I just want to convey to you what Learning Life does. And its core mission is to widen and deepen participation in democracy and diplomacy. So we are unusual in that sense, in that we're not really a conventional educational nonprofit focused on strictly what's happening in schools. Nor are we teaching or tutoring math or English or anything like that. We are building larger learning communities, more inclusive learning communities, to get people engaged in democracy and diplomacy. Okay, so I want to start with, there are 7 uncommon thoughts, and each one is numbered. And I want to start with a simple one around our relationships. The common thought is this, that when you care, you should first and foremost focus on your friends and your family. And that is a reasonable proposition, right? Your friends and your family are more likely to care for you, and therefore some sort of reciprocal obligation or sense of commitment is important. But the uncommon thought here is, and this is based on a lot of research, is that our fulfillment, and in fact, your president alluded to this in his remarks, our fulfillment, our efficacy, this is a political science term, but essentially our feeling that we can make changes in the world, and our trust in each other depends in part on connecting with people outside of our circles of friends and family. And that circle is that inner circle of friends and family. And that in particular, what I'm talking about are those middle and outer circles. So our acquaintances, neighbors, coworkers, sometimes coworkers, of course, become family or friends. But nonetheless, it's a kind of middle circle. And then a much broader circle of people, which essentially who are essentially strangers, but with whom our lives are inextricably intertwined, whether we like it or not, politically and economically in a globalizing world. And so that's fellow residents of our communities, local to global. It's fellow citizens. It depends on how you define citizen. It could be of your nation or of the world. And it's foreigners, people that we don't necessarily identify with. And sorry, I'm like letting people in as we go here. And the point is that democracies need citizens who can connect with and care for those in the middle and outer layers. So not just our friends and family. And this is important in part because as the President David mentioned, some of you may have heard of the concept of social capital, but social capital can be defined in different ways, but it's essentially your social relationships, how many people you know, how well you know them. And it turns out that's our social capital has major impacts on our long-term happiness and our health and the health of our communities, local to global. So it's really important for us to engage not just with our friends and family, but with a wider world, from our local communities to the wider world. And so as I talk about each of these 7 thoughts, uncommon thoughts, I'm going to give you some information about Learning Life and what we do. And I'm going to start with our Family Diplomacy Initiative. So the Family Diplomacy Initiative is a long-term effort to engage and activate the family as a civic agent in the world. Families are widely valued across the world. They're deeply impacted by all kinds of issues. And yet, when it comes to policymaking, they're not represented at the decision-making table the way that labor unions and businesses typically are. And we think they should be. And so we are building a family diplomacy initiative, which in the long term aims to connect what we call family diplomats, volunteers across the world who are trained and then connected to power, businesses, governments, media, and nonprofits to advocate for families. So number 2 is about democracy and particularly about what democracy is. And the common thought about democracy, when people think of democracy, they think of government. And they've probably heard the term of, by, and for the people from Lincoln. But I would like to suggest that at its best, and part of the reasons why we're having problems with democracy is because we have a thin version of democracy rather than what one might call a thick version of democracy. But that at its best, in the strongest or thickest form of democracy, it is not just a form of government. It is a lifestyle and a wider culture of participation and decision-making. So this has implications for our citizenship. And in particular, what I'd like to suggest is this concept of 3C citizens. So the best citizens are connected, they're capable, and they're caring. Connected citizens are people who are connected, as I mentioned, beyond their circle of friends and family to other people, to fellow citizens, and to strangers across the world. They develop relationships with people at different levels. in those concentric circles. And they are capable in the sense that they're informed and they're skilled. You might be asking, like, what kinds of skills does a citizen need to have? Well, imagine if you are having we just had, and we are going to continue to have climate change disasters, right? One just happened. We just had a hurricane come through, particularly hitting hard the Carolinas. And in those circumstances, our ability to connect with each other, collaborate, have social trust, communicate, and help each other depends in part on our capabilities as citizens, right? It's our knowledge, for instance, our knowledge of who to contact, and who else is in our network, and it's our skills. So skills in being able to mobilize people, being able to speak publicly, being able to organize people, being able to communicate effectively via various channels. There are all kinds of skills that citizens need to have. And then lastly, citizens can't just be connected and capable, they have to be caring, right? So you can have connected and capable people, but if they don't care about other people, and especially outside their boundaries of friends and family, then we've got problems. So we need these 3C citizens. And those 3 citizens are not born, they're made in everyday life, in certain lifestyle and culture, not through periodic elections. And I think part of the cynicism that people have towards politics is precisely the fact that politics is occasional. It is not a part of our everyday lives. And if it were more a part of our everyday lives, we would feel more connection with it. So this last point on with regards to learning life is that what we're trying to do is to develop that lifestyle and culture of democracy, and to do that through learning communities at local to international levels. Number 3 is about politics and whether it's optional or unavoidable. And I tell you this because in part, when I did my dissertation in sociology and political sociology, I was studying how young Americans, particularly young American professionals, think about politics. And as I was doing a lot of reading in order to be able to write, I learned that there are some sharp sharp generational differences in how Americans think about politics and whether or not it is a choice or an obligation. And it turns out that older generations, baby boomers, and prior generations, so the silent generation, and the quote unquote greatest generation, born anywhere between the 1920s and the 1965 or so, are more likely, in part because of the experiences they've had and the culture that they were embedded in, are more likely to think of voting in particular as an obligation. And younger generations, including my generation, Gen X, Gen Y, and Gen Z, sometimes called iGen, are more likely to think of it as a choice, not an obligation. And that has implications for democracy and whether or not people actually engage, of course, because if you think it's a choice, then you can say, well, I'd rather watch I'd rather play games or watch something else. That's my choice. You choose politics. That's good for you. But that's not my cup of tea. And that's deeply problematic in the long term for our ability to engage a wider spectrum of people. So here, Learning Life is trying to make it easier for people to engage in democracy by creating these learning communities. And one of them is our Family Diplomacy Initiative, which I've talked with you about a little bit. But the idea here is that we connect, engage people in learning, and get them to begin advocating. And currently we're focusing on 5 major issues impacting families, and they are war, climate change, poverty, gender-based violence, and the internet. Big issues impacting families across the world. So I want to give you a visual to give to kind of like punctuate a lot of text with some visuals. But this is our family diplomacy initiative. And the family diplomacy initiative is this is just a collage from over the last couple of years, engages people in different parts of the world in conversations via Zoom, and trainings essentially. So what they're learning about is citizen diplomacy. Citizen diplomacy is essentially when ordinary citizens collaborate and communicate across borders. And they're learning about citizenship and active citizenship and what that means. You can get an inkling of that if you can read that small writing from this slide. That's part of a presentation about citizen power. And they're learning about what's happening across the world, and they're learning certain advocacy skills, and particularly storytelling. So I'm going to give you some examples of some of the people that are working with us. Eric here comes from Burundi. Burundi is an African country that is suffering from substantial poverty. His family wants him to work and bring money home to the family that desperately needs it. He, however, has this massive passion for teaching English, and it's not right now translating into an actual occupation which is paying. But in the process of participating in the family diplomacy initiative, he's beginning to develop a group of people. You can see that behind him. And he's beginning to kind of grow his network, not just in his local community, but across the world, so that he can develop his voice, practice his English, get better at it, get better at teaching it to others, and talk about, in his case, this focus on poverty in his country and the kind of problems that his family and other families face. I'm going to give you another example. And this person you don't actually see in a very large photo of here, but Nusrat is from Bangladesh. Her family, as you might imagine, I don't know if you know, Bangladesh is next to India, is impacted by climate change. Bangladesh has a big population. It's a very relatively small country with a very large population, and a lot of them live very close to the coast, and they are affected by increasingly strong monsoon rains, just like India is. And so she has become an advocate for fighting climate change by talking about the impact it's had on her family and on her community and other families in her community. So these are a couple of examples, and I'm going to raise just one more, which is Fatima, which I don't know if you guys can see my cursor here, but it's this woman from Pakistan who is an advocate for women and against gender-based violence in her country. So she is a lawyer by training, but she has quit the law and become an advocate, going from one rural area to another in Pakistan and speaking to women and families and men about the importance of educating women, the importance of empowering women to be able to get work, because ultimately that matters to the health. And we know this from lots of development, research and international development, that when we empower women, give them a voice in their communities, they typically pay that community back with employment, not only of their family, but also better health for their family and employment in their community. So they create jobs and they create better conditions for their families. So these are some of the advocates that we're working with in different parts of the world. So number 4 is the citizen's role, and whether or not that involves voting or decision-making. And the common thought here is that for ordinary citizens, what democracy means is voting, right? And then maybe consuming some news and talking with your friends and family. The uncommon thought here is that democracy is not just voting. Democracy means participating in decision-making. And we might say that that's decision-making above all. Voting is a form of decision-making. It's indirect because we're electing our representatives, but there are ways in which we can directly participate in decision-making. And so there's growing development in democracy towards giving, and this is happening particularly in Europe, giving ordinary citizens voice in actual policy making. And this is happening through citizen assemblies, through policy juries, participatory budgeting, and other democratic innovations. On our end, what we're doing through Learning Life is developing a democracy learning community in the Washington, D.C. area that is getting, among other things, young people to practice policy making. And so on October 26th, we are organizing the first democracy festival in the Washington, D.C. area. That festival is going to engage a segment, what we hope is up to 150. And by the way, if any of you are in the DC area, we encourage you to invite your any youth that you know between ages 12 and 25 to participate. But on October 26th, Saturday, October 26th, from 1 to 5 p.m., young people from across the DC region are going to come together, learn, deliberate, and come up with policy proposals for how to deal with the mental health crisis that's happening among young people. It's a mental health crisis more generally, but it's happening particularly among young people. And so, this is a way to get young people not just to go through the motions periodically of voting, but actually participating in the policymaking process. And our hope is that this becomes an annual thing. This is the first time we're doing this, that it becomes annual, that the number of students participating in this over time grows, and that we connect it to power. So that it's not just an idle exercise in policymaking where we write their recommendations down and we pass it on to politicians for them to ignore it politely, but rather it comes to inform policymaking around decisions that affect young people's lives. Number 5 is freedom, and particularly whether or not freedom is license or self-government. Now, when most Americans, if you ask most Americans what they think freedom is, they would probably answer something like this, which is, it's my ability to do what I want so long as I don't bother other people. That is a quite individualistic and libertarian concept of freedom, which is in part why the Libertarian Party in the United States has some resonance, is because they advocate for that form of freedom. Your ability to do what you want, smoke pot, live as you wish, as long as you don't bother other people. A more uncommon concept of freedom, which is related much more closely to democracy, is one in which we define it as individual and collective self-government. It's our ability to manage ourselves and to manage each other collectively through communities. And what I want to suggest is that these different concepts of freedom have big implications for what we end up doing with our everyday lives. When we think of democracy and freedom as license, as my ability, and you might say kind of this concept, it's Jeffersonian concept of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness tends to align with that common conception, which is I get to do what I want so long as I don't bother other people. What that leads is, of course, to a diversity of ways of life, which is fine in some ways, but it also, and then mainly, and this is an argument I'm making, you can push back on me with this, that it also leads to what the economist turned sociologist Juliet Schor calls a work-spend cycle, to what other sociologists, Robert Bellah and others, have called lifestyle enclaves, and what our most recent, our current Surgeon General calls a loneliness epidemic in the United States. Vivek Murthy has declared a loneliness and isolation epidemic in the US. And the point is that when we all lead our own separate lives, we are at risk for those things. We are at risk for a kind of vicious cycle stimulated by all kinds of industries that are trying to get us to consume more. We may work hard and then we want to play hard, but that gets us caught in this vicious cycle I now have a house and a nice car and all these subscriptions, et cetera, and so forth. And in order to pay for all those things, I got to work even harder. And that vicious cycle of work and spend is preventing us in some ways from having a more fulfilling, socially fulfilling lives. Lifestyle enclaves are essentially enclaves of similarity. They are places where people find themselves rather than connecting across difference in our diverse world. And so self-government is harder because it requires more restraint. That is, we have to talk with people who are different from ourselves and restrain ourselves when we disagree, and sometimes quite strongly with those people. It requires engagement across difference because we live in a diverse country. Oftentimes we live in diverse local communities, and we live in a very diverse world. And it requires compromise because power and participation in power means we can't have all the say. We have to essentially compromise with other people to come to agreement on things and get things done. So we're trying through Learning Life to make this easier by developing regional democracy learning communities that, for example, get youth practicing decision-making. As I mentioned, through this youth assembly on mental health, the first one on October 26th. This one is one of my favorites to talk about because I think it's something that we don't think about as much, but it's going to come with a long quote. So and a long quote that's coming up from Alexis de Tocqueville. So I'm sure some of you have heard of Alexis de Tocqueville. Alexis de Tocqueville was a French aristocrat, came to the United States in the 1830s, and wrote one of the most enduring studies of politics called Democracy in America. And it still has some bearing for our lives, arguably, in many ways. But I want to give you a sense of two different kinds of power and two different kinds of despotism or authoritarianism that we risk. And one of them Americans are more aware of, and the other we're less aware of. The one that we're more aware of is the one that is in George Orwell's Big Brother. Excuse me, in his book 1984, and that's Big Brother. So Big Brother is this all-seeing government, and it is if you don't do as you're told, it is physically oppressive. It will throw you in prison, it will torture you, etc., and so forth. In a different book by a different author, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, we have a very different, in some ways, very different vision. Yes, it is an all-seeing kind of government, but he calls it a world state. It's not a big brother. And that big brother, that world state has a stifling impact on our lives, not so much by physical oppression, but rather by mental pacification through a drug called Soma, which it's widely available. And other kind of practices to get people to kind of focus on their pleasures at the expense of their responsibilities. And so the implication here is that if we're focused strictly on Big Brother, we miss out on ways in which there are ways in which we are being threatened, our democracy is being threatened through softly despotic threats. And my suggestion is this may not just be government, it may in fact in some ways be business. And as I think about that, I'd like you to think about artificial intelligence, disinformation, social media, and all of the manipulations that come along. Some of them we're not aware of, and the addictions that come along with those things. And so the quote I'm about to give you from Tocqueville, if you think of it in the context of that, that what I'm saying may resonate. What Learning Life is doing is we're advancing what I call signia over trivia. So trivia is trivial information. Signia is significant information. Trivial information, arguably, is who's winning what, and I apologies to the sports fans among you, but and it is fun to watch sports, don't get me wrong, I like basketball, but who's winning in whatever sport, or who's dating who in Hollywood, those things are fun. And I am part of it. I love watching that stuff, et cetera, and so forth. But it's relatively trivial information compared to significant information, like who is taxing us and what are they doing with our taxes? Or what is this policy around Social Security? It may be boring oftentimes, but that boring policymaking has direct and oftentimes massive impacts on our lives in ways that sports and our social media, et cetera, and so forth, and all this this trivia that we're awash in has less impact. So we are looking through our communities, our learning communities, to focus people on signia rather than trivia, and on connection over loneliness and these kind of enclaves of similarity by developing communities that are diverse, right? That connect people across lines of difference and get them to form relationships, and then ultimately connect them to power. Okay, so here's the quote from Tocqueville. I see an innumerable multitude of men, alike and equal, constantly circling around in pursuit of the petty and banal pleasures with which they glut their souls. By the way, he is imagining the future of democracy in America here. Mankind, each one of them, withdrawn into himself, is almost unaware of the fate of the rest. Mankind for him consists in his children and his personal friends, his circle of friends and family. Over this kind of men stands an immense protective power, which is alone responsible for securing their enjoyment and watching over their fate. That power is absolute, thoughtful of detail, orderly, provident, and gentle. It would resemble parental authority if, father-like, it tried to prepare its charges for a man's life. But on the contrary, it only tried to keep them in perpetual childhood. It likes to see the citizens enjoy themselves, provided that they think of nothing but enjoyment. Why should it not entirely relieve them from the trouble of thinking and all the cares of living? Thus, it daily makes the exercise of free choice less useful and rarer, restricts the activity of free will within a narrower compass, and little by little robs each citizen of the proper use of his own faculties. Having thus taken each citizen in turn, in its powerful grasp, and shaped him to its will, government then extends its embrace to include the whole of society. It covers the whole of social life with a network of petty, complicated rules that are both minute and uniform. It does not break men's will, but softens, bends, and guides it. It seldom enjoins, but often inhibits action. It does not destroy anything, but prevents much from being born. It is not at all tyrannical, but hinders, restrains, enervates, stifles, and stultifies so much that in the end, each nation is no more than a flock of timid and hardworking animals with the government as its shepherd. So last thought I have for you here is about politicians and citizens. And here, what I want to address is this common thought and common, forgive my language here, but that a lot of people are pissed off at politicians. And there's well-known finding in political science, which is that people hate politicians, but they really like their own US representative, in other words, their own politician, right? Because they know that person. But generally speaking, we hate politicians as Americans. And more, we hate them more and more, to the point that we're trying to assassinate them, unfortunately, once again. And so that's the problem, right? Clearly, it's a problem if we're starting to try to attempt assassination of presidents. But there is a more uncommon sense that is important to remember, ultimately, which is that in democracies, politicians are only as good as their voters. The implication here is that good government requires good citizens, those 3C citizens I was talking about, connected, capable, and caring citizens. And it requires good citizens that are not born, but that they're made every day through lifestyle and culture, not just through periodic elections. And so in making that happen, right, how do we make this happen? How do we think beyond voting? I think that we need to be thinking in terms of building communities, democratic communities, and that those communities need to develop institutions, right? I go back to those points I made at the very start and that are drawing from sociology: culture, institutions, and relationships. And communities of people who care about democracy can come together in metro regions to develop various things, as we are doing here in the Washington, D.C. area, to get more people across lines of difference engaged in democracy. And that means, among other things, and this is, I'm trying to make this more specific for you because it can be quite vague. It means developing shows, sometimes TV shows. It means developing exhibits. And some of those are like outdoor installations that tell people about their local history or that connect people to the wider world through screens. It means dialogues of different kinds and debates. It means having games, indoors and outdoor games. It means civic fairs and what we're doing, a democracy festival. It means what we call signia surfaces. So printing significant information on, let's say, coasters, placemats, in fortune cookies. By the way, we used to do this. And then placing it in restaurants and other places in people's lives and inviting people to learn about their wider world through these objects in their everyday lives. So what does a democracy, a vibrant democracy community look like? I'm not going to go through all of this, but what I want to convey to you here is that it involves changing the fabric of life in families, in schools, after school, at work, in media, in shopping centers and malls, in public and green spaces. And yes, it involves shaping the lives of the growing number of Americans and of people across the world who are 65 and older or retired or trying to retire. It means shaping their lives as well. So I'm going to finish with this photo collage, and that is a photo of the democracy learning community that we're developing in the Washington, D.C. area. You actually see some folks here. In fact, I think if they're still with us, I have Seth Radwell is joining us, I think, if he's still here. And he was part of a panel, as well as Bill Schneider, both authors, and kindly joining us on this discussion. And I would love to hear their thoughts as well. And Bill Schneider, by the way, I like to embarrass him by reminding everybody that you don't recognize him. He was on CNN for 20 years as one of their senior political correspondents. So I got to know him that way, especially around election time. And he is still not on CNN, but on other venues talking about elections.
Thanks,
Okay.
Paul. I'm here too.
Thank you. And I'm totally apologize. I did not give you much time for your thoughts here, but I do want to go back to these questions that I'm going to repost. Hold on a second here to get your thoughts. And if you could raise your hands electronically, I would much appreciate your thoughts. Let me put it in the Zoom chat again. Okay. So first question is, drawing on your professional experience and what you've learned in your classes, if you're a student, which of the 7 thoughts struck you and why? And then secondly, any of these thoughts about which you disagree or have alternative thoughts? In the spirit of democracy, disagreement is good. And if you don't raise your hands, I will pick on people, people that I know at least. So I do want you to step forward. And Seth, Steve, and Bill, I will be calling on you if we don't hear from others. But I really would love for you guys to chime in. Not as David pointed out, democracy is not a spectator sport.
Given there's a big gap, Paul, I'll jump in for a second and just say that I thought the points you raised were fascinating. And it just reminds me of the degree to which one of the key tensions we see in the political landscape today is one I write about a lot of the American schism, but is one between what does a democracy or a democratic republic say on who has the authority to govern? Is it the elite establishment who seems to have power over many decades, or is it more a populist movement where people need to kind of take the reins of government through both elections and other fora to be able to have their voices heard? And how do we think about balancing those different forces?
And I'm not going to, unless you guys have specific questions for me, I'm not going to say anything. And I am going to draw, in fact, on some of your comments here as part of my purpose in having you kind of introduce yourselves. There was one of you, AJ. I don't know if AJ, you're with us still. If you care to share your thoughts, because you said here, number 3 is a great point, as many folks have become disconnected from the entire voting process, even getting that knowledge of candidates and issues. Do you want to share further? Alban Jones.
Yes, absolutely. I graduated last year from Excelsior, so I'm a proud alumni. And I love being a part of these conversations, because this is what I feel is the big problem we have is it's a lack of educated, and you don't have to be, high school, college, degree type education. It's just general knowledge. And when folks are disconnected from the knowledge, they will not make informed decisions. And you hit a beautiful point when you talked about how media has a way of kind of distracting us, if you will. It takes us down that path of, the Bachelorette and, what's going on with the sports right now as the playoffs hit in baseball. And people get distracted because when the tsunami hits, when the economy crashes, when your streets are unsafe, none of those things help you. Okay, it's bringing democracy back that helps people, that stops looking as individuals and look at the greater good of society. So for your points, the ones that really resonated with me, I hit number 3 because when I saw that, it meant something to me. But if I had to pick the top 3 for myself, number 5, freedom. I'm a big proponent of freedom, not in the sense of just being free to do what you want, but having the autonomy to be able to make your own choices. I also think that without relationships, nothing gets done without relationships. The way you were able to come on here and speak to us today, you could sat in a vacuum. It would have never happened unless you developed those relationships to give you this opportunity. Mm-hmm. And then number 3, as you said, actually, excuse me, it would be number 2, democracy, because this is the greatest social experiment in the history of mankind. And if it falls apart in America, it'll never happen again in the history of the world. Thank you.
Alban, thank you. Thanks for your points here. Your good points. I'm wondering if Sharon Zula, are you still with us? Sharon with us? I'm looking through and seeing. So she was with us for a moment, but I would love to. So I'm pointing to her in part because she's a paralegal. It would be great to get her perspective as a paralegal. I'm also interested in hearing from women among you because we men tend to speak more, and it would be great to hear from Erin or Jane or May or Mary if you have some thoughts, or Betty or Larissa. or Heidi, or Anne, or Lorraine. There are a number of you.
I will try and keep the floor open. I always have lots of thoughts, but I don't want to jump in and then speak over anyone. So please.
May I see you smiling? There's a thought behind that smile. May Boggs.
Um, Thank you, Paul. Like, you're putting me on the spot here. To me, the thing that resonated the most, I guess, was the Big Brother versus the despotism. Is that how you say it? Because it's, like, and it resonated with me because, yes, there's always, like, personally for me, like, that fear of big government, like, control over what we're doing. But on the flip side of that is the signia over trivia, right? Where we are not really thinking about those I guess you could call it like an unseen sort of threat, because we're not cognizant of it. We're not totally aware that it is a threat when when all these things happen. So those are my thoughts.
Great. Thanks, May.
I'll speak up as more a representative of the younger generations. It's not so much that resonate is not the right word. More of I got stuck on. One of the parts that I kind of I hear a lot, and I would love if we could reframe how we think about it. It's because I completely agree with your statement on the fact that a lot of our generation, the younger generations, tend to think of democracy as being a choice to participate in. And I agree with you that we shouldn't be thinking of it that way. We should be thinking of it as it is our choice in how we choose to participate. But I think a lot of times, a lot of the younger generation gets put off, not because, oh, well, it's easier to just go watch The Bachelor. Oh, it's easier to go just do all the fun stuff. And I want to do the fun stuff instead of the hard work. The reality is, I think we feel like we get taken out of the conversation. I mean, you think about it as a millennial, only 3% of Congress is millennials, even though we are the largest voting demographic in the country. We get a lot of the condescending rhetoric of Pokemon go to the polls, like these weird attempts to talk to us about things that are very real in our lives. And a lot of times people feel not so much that they don't want to participate because there's more fun things to do, but because they don't feel like they have the proper representation of what to choose between. I personally don't think that that's the right way to look at it, but I know that that's how a lot of people feel. They feel that, this candidate and this candidate are not representing me sufficiently. And so they choose not to participate at all because they don't feel like it encompasses everything. So I think addressing that is the bigger issue as opposed to just making it fun, because I think people would find it fun if they felt like they were being represented and being heard, and had a voice at the table and not just treated as a child, because most of us are in our 30s and 40s, and so that was just kind of where I landed.
Yeah, and Daniel, I don't know if you'll permit us to go just 5 minutes over because I would love to hear more thoughts. Is that okay?
Absolutely. Yeah, and we understand if anybody needs to leave, but absolutely, let's keep on the conversation.
I would love to hear from Anne, who has her hand up, and Aaron, you actually were going to say something, but then decided to hold off. So we'd love to hear from you too. Anne?
Yeah, I think the generational discussion is interesting. And I'm wondering, as someone on the older end of the spectrum, I've always been interested and involved in local politics, reading. I mean, I have, my background isn't that educationally, but I also think when I was younger, you could have said some of the same things that you're saying now about the generations being involved. I think, when I was in my 20s and 30s, I think I was, although aware of things going on in the world, I had other obligations, young children, other kinds of things, trying to get established professionally, that left me less time to participate, right? Or to even sometimes inform myself. about, politics or, voting. I always voted, I'm kind of boring. I have never not voted in any election, but, maybe I'm an outlier on that. But I do think that's a conversation to have. And I also am concerned and wonder about, everybody's stretched. There's so much information out there. It's distracting, as somebody said. But even for young people, and I mean kids in school, not college, but younger than that, what are they actually learning about all this in school? It seems, and I might be wrong about this, but that there is less attention paid to these kinds of, to civic education and things like that than used to be paid. And that's a big loss for society. And there are also fewer civic organizations and even things like, a lack of Girl Scout troops or something in a lot of communities. So people don't have opportunities to connect at a young age and start to get involved in some of the things that I agree that you're talking about are really important. So that's just a comment.
Yeah, and your sense is right that civic education has shrunk or has withered over time. There are some efforts to reinvigorate it, but that's a good observation. Erin?
I love hearing the conversation, and I'll piggyback on a few of the ideas shared. But Silver, you really sparked the idea for me about, not just the choosing to participate, but how you want to participate and what that process might look like. And building on what you said, I've got 2 teenagers of my own, and watching them watch politics this season has been really interesting and informative for me, because they're really engaged. Their friends are really engaged. I found out some news because they were texting and Snapchatting and every other kind of messaging each other as news was unfurling, because they were so keyed into it. And they're always getting those kind of alerts. So I have a lot of hope for, younger generation and what they want to do. And I really hope that we can find ways to have them reflected in democracy so that they can participate. I will mute because I'm getting a call. Excuse me.
Yeah, sure. And if I'm going to put a couple things, if you're interested in engaging in our work, I put a few things in the Zoom chat that you can subscribe to or just learn more about. But would love to hear from Bill Schneider, who is, as I mentioned, former CNN senior political analyst for about 20 years, and is still commenting in various ways. And has a long history of kind of thinking about democracy and has written about authoritarianism. Bill, do you have any thoughts on what I shared? And then perhaps we might finish with that, and because I want to respect your time. This was only supposed to go until 4:30, but it would be great to hear his thoughts. Oh, you have to unmute.
Have I unmuted now?
Yes.
Okay. I think the true test of a democracy is very simple. It's not having an election and putting people in power. It is seeing people give up power. A government is willing to give up power in the expectation that it can regain it at some point. That is always a test of democracy. Communist regimes and fascist regimes fail that test. Once they're in power, they demand the right to stay in power. They will not leave power. It was part of the Brezhnev doctrine in the Soviet Union that when a country became communist, it could never become uncommunist. And of course, fascist regimes, Mussolini or Hitler's regime or Franco, they believed that they could not ever be allowed to lose power. That is a denial of the essence of democracy. The meaning of democracy is essentially that a government or people who are power holders must be willing at some point to leave power if they lose the confidence of the voters. The United States almost, thank goodness we did not, but we almost failed that test after the 2020 election, when Donald Trump was unwilling to leave power and tried to manipulate a way to stay in power. Although now it's not clear, he seems to deny it. But that to me is the essence of democracy. The test of democracy is not whether you hold an election, but whether the party or people in power are willing to leave power in the expectation that they can regain it.
Mhm. So one last point just to wrap things up, because and I want to go back to what Silver said because I think it resonated with a number of you. And that is that I think you're absolutely right. That it's not that I think engaging younger people is about giving them more voice, but it may not just be representatives. It may actually be involving ordinary citizens in policymaking, which is why we're doing this youth assembly on mental health. And so I just want to leave you all with this thought that democracy is not just voting. Democracy is participation in policymaking. It's participation in power, and we have to think about how do we make that happen. And so thinking about these concepts of citizen assemblies, participatory budgeting, et cetera, and so forth, are the beginnings of answers to that, that we need everybody to be participating, not just our politicians. So really want to thank you for your thoughts and your engagement. And I think that's it for me.
Paul, it's hard for me to follow, but we want to express our deepest gratitude for your time, for your willingness to share your knowledge and your wisdom and your work, which is incredibly inspiring. You can see in the chat, it's about to burst in appreciation for your work and for your presence. I was mentioning in the chat that the Center for Social Justice is thrilled to be developing a partnership with Learning Life and with Paul. So we're making some scholarships available for participation in Learning Life's programs. If you're interested, please connect with Pam or me, and then we'll connect you. Paul, I was really struck by the focus on moving away from individualism into collective decision-making and the work that requires. The way in which I think of it in higher education is how do we help our students define success collectively? And how important that is, right? As we are participating in the preparation of our next generation of leaders. And I also love the emphasis on citizens or good citizens not being born but made, and the work that requires from all of us and our facilitation of that process. A lot of wonderful pieces of wisdom and knowledge and insight. Paul, thank you so much for sharing those with us. Everyone, thank you for participating in today's program. One thing that I am very clear is that democracy is not just one conversation. So let's continue the work and let's find ways of engaging.
Thank you all for sticking around.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul.
All right.
Bye,
Thanks,
everybody.
Paul.
Thank you, everyone.